Dr. Walford, we were looking at the issue of hepatitis, knowledge of risks of hepatitis. In terms of relative risks of commercial products and NHS products, I think you've said in your statement there was a general view, which you shared, that UK plasma from voluntary donors carried less risk than US plasma from paid donors. That was the broad understanding.
In terms of plasma, absolutely. Not necessarily in terms of large pool concentrates, though.
Well, I think what you also say in your statement, but please correct me if I'm wrong, is there was a general understanding of which you two were part, that the larger the pool size, the greater the risk.
Yeah.
What you then said in your statement is that you don't think it was appreciated, at least by you, until a slightly later point in time, and you've referred to the publication by Fletcher, that there came a point in time where the pool size was such that the risk of infection with hepatitis was near inevitable.
Yes, I don't know that I knew that early on, but it obviously became apparent that pretty well all concentrates from whatever provenance, UK donors or commercial donors, because of the pool size, they were going to transmit non-A, non-B.
Now, we've looked at your own knowledge as a haematologist and having authored the publications that we looked at before lunch and therefore read the various papers. Just want to explore with you a little what the wider knowledge within the department might have been. I appreciate there's a limit to the extent to which you can speak to the knowledge of others or speak to something nebulous such as the knowledge of the department. But what you say in your statement is that you think within the department the risk of hepatitis B through transfusion was pretty well known and understood.
Yes.
You've said you think that there was non-A, non-B hepatitis was a problem known to the department, known within the department, but you think there was a less of an appreciation of the risks of serious liver disease from non-A, non-B hepatitis.
Well, of course, I'm not in a position to know for sure, but I think it was the case that everybody knew about non-A, non-B. They were not necessarily aware or conscious of the fact that it potentially could give rise to severe chronic disease. I mean, they knew that it would give rise to hepatitis, and maybe they knew that sometimes it was asymptomatic and sometimes it was overt, the hepatitis. But I don't think at this remove, and I'm trying not to overlay it with thoughts that I have now rather than thoughts that I had then, I don't think they appreciated that it was potentially more severe than they might have thought it was. And that was one of the reasons why I spoke about it really quite forcibly in my minute through to Mr. Harley, 15th of September 1980.
And I'm going to look at that with you in just a moment. Before I do that, am I right in understanding that amongst the papers that you reviewed for the purposes of the publications we looked at, the paper by Professor Preston, published in 1978, was not one of those which you reviewed?
It wasn't supplied to me, no.
Do you recall how or when you became aware of that?
I have to tell you that I became aware of Professor Preston's paper through the inquiry. But I have, of course, since read it.
So I want to go then to your memo of the 15th of September 1980, to which you've just referred. Seamus, it's WITN 0282008, please. We'll come back to this memo at a later stage in terms of the issue about BPL, but I just want to look for present purposes at what you say about hepatitis. So the context is the blood products laboratory, the possible takeover by industry, and Beecham's then being the company whose involvement was being contemplated. And then you say in the paragraph numbered 1, picking it up in the second sentence, unless it were Beecham's intention to process such plasma in an entirely separate plant or with complete duplication of all facilities in a single plant, it would be impossible to prevent contamination of the UK material with imported hepatitis viruses. I must emphasise that 90% of all post-transfusion and blood product infusion hepatitis in the USA and elsewhere is caused by non-A, non-B hepatitis viruses, which, unlike hepatitis B, cannot at present be detected by testing donor blood. This form of hepatitis can be rapidly fatal, particularly when acquired by patients with pre-existing liver disease, or can lead to progressive liver damage. It can also result in a chronic carrier state, thus increasing the pool of these viruses in the community. And if we just look at the top of the page, we can see, as you said a few moments ago, it's addressed to Mr. Harley. Now, leaving aside for present purposes the rest of it and the context of the memo, which, as I say, we'll come back to when we look at BPL, you were describing non-A, non-B hepatitis there, if I may say so, in no uncertain terms, as a serious condition.
Yeah.
And we can see it's addressed to effectively your equivalent number in, was he HS1?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Anyway,
Or HS.
in HS.
HS.
So you're not saying it's a largely benign condition.
No.
You're recognising the consequences and you're sharing those consequences with your administrative and policy colleagues. Did you ever get a sense that what you were saying to Mr. Harley came as a surprise in relation to the risks of non-A, non-B hepatitis?
I couldn't say that necessarily. I did copy this minute because I wasn't sure how much the department, my colleagues, were aware that this was potentially a much more serious disease, and they may have actually thought it was. I copied it pretty widely, so I copied it to his boss and my boss
Can we go to
as
the
well.
bottom of the second page? You're right to point that out, Dr. Walford. So we can see it's published to Dr. Oliver, who was your boss, so in the medical division, Mr. Wormold, who was senior civil servant on the administrative side.
It was Mr. Harley's boss.
And Mr. Godfrey.
Was the principal in Mr.
Mr. Hart.
He was head of the supply division.
Dr. Wintersgill.
He was, I think, the medical opposite number to Mr. Hart. I could be wrong about that, but I seem to recall.
Mrs. Firth.
Finance, as far as I know.
Mr. Brecken.
Yes, I think he was.
Brecken.
Thank you. He was also finance, as far as I can recall.
Mr. Sharp.
Probably supply. I don't
worry,
really know.
Dr. Davey.
I don't know who Dr. Davey. I must have known, but I don't know now.
And then we've got Miss Helson and Mr. Connor.
I don't know, unless Mr. Connor is the same chief architect, Mr. Connor.
And no doubt, in part, the reason for the wide circulation was because this was dealing with the issue about commercial takeover, hence the involvement of supplies and finance.
And Mr. Hart.
But in terms of what you were saying about non-A, non-B hepatitis, this is going, as it were, to those who are above you.
Yes.
In terms of seniority, both in the medical hierarchy and in the administrative / policy hierarchy.
Yes.
So whatever their state of knowledge, and I appreciate you can't speak for what other individuals might have known at any given time prior to that, no one receiving this memo could have been under any illusion from this point onwards about non-A, non-B hepatitis.
I hope not.
Do you know whether what this information you were providing, this advice you were providing about non-A, non-B hepatitis was shared more widely within the department?
I couldn't say. I don't know.
And then, can you recall the extent to which you or your colleagues, on the question of hepatitis, and in particular non-A, non-B hepatitis, ever took advice from or sought the input of hepatologists?
Not directly, but I do remember hearing Professor Ari Zuckerman talk about, and this is on one of my visits out or my committee meetings with the MRC, I think, a post-transfusion hepatitis MRC meeting. Actually, what Professor Zuckerman said at this particular meeting that I have in mind, which came as a surprise to me, was that the researchers had shown that non-A, non-B hepatitis, unlike hepatitis B, did not seem to be sexually transmitted. That was a revelation to me. I didn't know that.
And then if we can look at your witness statement, I think it's Part 63. And again, if we put this up on screen, Seamus, it's WITN 44610001. And if we go to page 153, you set out in paragraph 63.1 the question you were asked by the inquiry, which was an explanation of what, if any, steps were taken and when and by whom to ensure that the serious nature of non-A, non-B hepatitis, as summarised in my minute of the 15th of September 1980, was known to and understood by ministers, clinicians, NHS bodies, patients who were or might be treated with blood or blood products, the public. And then, if we just go through what you then say in response to that, you say in paragraph 63.2 that you don't believe at the time the potential severity of non-A, non-B hepatitis was in any way well known outside of a body of relevant researchers and hepatologists. And I'm not going to ask you further in relation to that. The inquiry has asked its own questions of clinicians in relation to what they did know or what they should have known. You then refer to haemophilia centre directors getting the reports from Dr. Krask. You then, at paragraph 63.4, deal with the question of information to patients. Mm-hmm. You say the DHSS would not have regarded itself as having a role in advising clinicians what to tell their patients about hepatitis risks, as that was a matter which lay within the boundaries of the individual clinician-patient relationship. However, the licensing authority's regulation of blood products covered the issue of product information, and then you're not able to state what information would have been conveyed by labels on blood products or patient information leaflets. And then you refer to there being posters and other information available where patients were having blood tests, which describe the risks of hepatitis. Now, just pausing there, perhaps if we go back to the previous page, should we go back to the question that's asked?
Could I just intervene for a moment?
Of course.
In relation to the licensing authority, I am pretty certain that the product information, the leaflets, which went to both patients and the leaflets for doctors, will have mentioned hepatitis. But they may not have mentioned specifically non-A, non-B, because, of course, we knew next to nothing about that in terms of what exactly it was, but it will have mentioned hepatitis, I'm pretty certain.
And the inquiry will be looking at the content of those leaflets in a later hearing. But if we just go back to the question, and I want to put it in perhaps slightly different terms from the way in which it's put in question 63.1. My question is, what, if any, steps were taken by the department to ensure that the serious nature of non-A, non-B hepatitis, as summarised in the document we've just looked at, was known to and understood by, leave aside ministers for a moment, clinicians, NHS bodies, patients or public, other than through product information leaflets and the licensing authority's role? Would it be right to understand that the department itself took no particular steps to explain the serious nature of non-A, non-B to either clinicians, NHS bodies or patients or the public?
It would not have expected to explain the nature to clinicians. It would have expected, in the generality of clinicians, if we're not talking about haemophilia centre directors, and we know that they had the information from Krask, they had the information from Krask that the rest of the department, if you like, or those of us who were involved, were privy to. So the haemophilia centre directors were aware, or should have been aware, of almost as much, if you like, as I have described, if not as much. And the generality of clinicians, because we must remember that this was transmissible through blood and cryoprecipitate. It sort of knew no boundaries. It wasn't simply commercial or NHS factor 8 concentrates. This was completely transmissible by blood. Basically, I think the department will have relied on information coming from the usual sources. It will have been descriptions in the medical journals, for example, or any specialist societies who were putting out anything. But basically, I think the department took the view that this was clinical material which doctors ought to make themselves aware of through their own reading or their own studies, or they should be made aware of them through their specialist societies or in the case of haemophiliacs, the haemophilia centre directors. We would not have been describing this to patients, to doctors directly.
And if we just then go to paragraph 63.2, that's even though there was potentially an information gap, because you've said in terms there that you don't think at the time the potential severity of non-A, non-B hepatitis was well known outside of researchers and hepatologists. You've explained why you think haemophilia clinicians should have known through Dr. Krask and the Hepatitis Working Party and so on. But you appear to be recognising there that there would be a large cohort of clinicians who wouldn't necessarily know. So is it right to understand, and it may be for all the reasons we've discussed earlier about the department's view of its role, but it's right to understand simply as a matter of fact, the department itself didn't take any steps to address that particular information gap?
Well, I don't know how necessarily that there needed to have been a gap, because it was absolutely open to doctors to read the Lancet, to read the Preston document publication, to read those publications that I have mentioned. For example, the publication by Wyke about the fatal cases in the Lancet, before I actually described it in the department. So it was in the medical journals. It would be impossible for the Department of Health to take every new development and go out to clinicians and say, by the way, you have heard of this, haven't you? You do know. One did rely, these were professionals. One relied on professionals making themselves aware of issues within their sphere of interest. And if not the professionals themselves reading journals, it's impossible to read everything comprehensively, on the professional societies that they belong to, or any of the training materials that they would have had. I can't conceive really of a position in which the department could constantly update the profession, the medical profession, on every advance or every new development in every sphere, because this was one sphere of information, but of course the department was dealing across the board with every single disease.
And then if we go to the next page, paragraph 63.5, the question also asked you about the provision of information to ministers, and you've said, I think, in terms in 63.5, you don't know if the potential for chronic liver damage and severe disease from non-A, non-B hepatitis was particularly flagged up to ministers.
I don't know.
Are you able to assist with this? What, if any, consideration was given by the department in the late 1970s, early 1980s, to the possibility that pooled products might transmit viruses not yet known to medical science? In other words, was there a recognition of known unknowns, that there could potentially be things out there, things in blood that could be dangerous, but which weren't yet identified and understood?
I think it was implicit in anybody who had to do with blood transfusion that you knew that potentially blood transfusion could transmit an agent that we never heard of before, never seen before, didn't know about. Of course, that transpired to be the case with AIDS, and it also transpired to be potentially the case with new variant CJD. What one knew was that potentially there was blood transfusion was inherently hazardous. You did everything possible in the blood transfusion service to reduce the hazard, the risk coming out of blood transfusion. So anything you could screen for, you should screen for. Any donors that should be asked not to donate, you dealt with. But inherently, you don't know what you don't know. You only know that it could happen. And in fact, it did happen.
Now, I just want to ask you next about some of the expert groups, advisory groups, working parties that were involved with hepatitis,
Yes.
late 70s, early 1980s. You've referred in your statement, I'm not going to take you to it because you weren't there, but just to get some dates understood. You've referred in your statement to a February 1979 ad hoc meeting at the Medical Research Council. It was attended by your predecessor. I think your predecessor, Dr. Waiter, wasn't there. Someone else from the DHSS attended in her place. So that was an ad hoc meeting, out of which there appears to have grown something called the Working Party on Post-Transfusion Hepatitis, which you were then part of. And I just want to look at those with 2 sets of minutes briefly with you. So if we can go to MRCO 5029_003. So we'll see from this, it's headed Medical Research Council, Blood Transfusion Research Committee, Working Party on Post-Transfusion Hepatitis, first meeting 14th of February 1980. And then if we look at the list of attendees, we can see Dr. Gunson there, Dr. Krask, Dr. McClellan, Dr. Howard Thomas is there, and then you're there, and Professor Zuckerman's there. What was your role in this working party?
Well, it's a very good question, because I was there, I was representing the department. I don't know specifically why I was there, except perhaps as a sort of liaison from the MRC over to any of the other working parties that I might have been associated with. I don't know, and we may look, but I don't know if I actually said anything at this meeting at all. Did I contribute?
I'm afraid I can't remember without checking.
Neither can I.
In any event, if we pick things up at the bottom of that page, we can see the purpose of the working party, and then there's reference to the advisory group on testing for the presence of hepatitis B antigen and its antibody. We'll come on to that. There's reference to the ad hoc group that met in February 1979. That's the one I referred to. Oh, there. Here we are. You do contribute.
Right.
Dr. Walford said that a new DHSS advisory group would shortly be formed to advise on the public health aspects of hepatitis.
Oh.
So we'll look at that committee in a while.
Okay.
It was agreed that the function of the MRC-WP, so the MRC Working Party, was to promote research to assess the nature and size of the problem of post-transfusion hepatitis in the UK, with particular reference to changes in transfusion practice, e.g. the use of products prepared from pooled plasma from large numbers of donors and the introduction of commercial products from abroad. Studies should include 1, an assessment of any further need for research into hepatitis B, 2, investigations to assess the incidence of non-A, non-B hepatitis in the UK, particularly with the risk of introducing the infection by blood transfusions, and 3, the position of research to characterise the agents associated with this form of hepatitis and to derive diagnostic tests. So that's the purpose of it. And would it be right to understand that's why it's under the auspices of the Medical Research Council, because its focus is on research, but specifically into post-transfusion hepatitis, including non-A, non-B?
Yes.
If we go a little further down that page, we can see the heading, the problems of non-A, non-B hepatitis viruses. There's reference to a wide-ranging discussion and there's contributions from Professor Zuckerman, Dr. Krask, cases at the Oxford Haemophilia Centre. And then if we go to the next paragraph, we can see it's recorded there's a problem of non-A, non-B hepatitis related to freeze-dried factor 8 and 9, both of NHS and commercial types imported from Austria and the USA. There's reference to a study at the Royal Free described by Dr. Thomas and it talks about evidence obtained by liver biopsy that a proportion of these cases might suffer chronic sequelae and so on. Now, I'm not going to go through the detail of everything that was discussed at the meeting, but broadly speaking, would it have been part of your role to feed this back, at least if there was any new information, to colleagues in the department?
If there'd been something new and revelatory, yes, I would have said so. But I don't know whether there was at that particular meeting. I mean, in general, I tried to be quite helpful as between what I'm hearing at meetings and what I'm saying back at the department and vice versa.
And then there's a second meeting of this particular working party. So this first one's February 1980. The second one's June 1981. NHBT 5068_049, I think. So we can see from the top, it is the second meeting, 25th of June 1981. Similar attendees. Again, you're there. There's just one aspect of the discussion I wanted to ask you about. So if we go to page 5. Sorry, if we just go to the previous page so we can put it in context. Bottom of the previous page, there's a heading, Hepatitis and Haemophilia, report by Dr. Krask. And then if we go to the next page, he continues his report and I think refers to the data he's gathered through his surveillance programme. And then if we look at the last main paragraph, Dr. Krask concluded by saying that there was little information about the incidence of symptomless hepatitis and the relative risks of hepatitis due to different brands of factor 8 and 9. And then this, the DHSS were keen that a prospective study of patients undergoing elective treatment requiring concentrate should be undertaken to provide answers to these problems and to provide a collection of well-documented sera and other specimens for use in the development of serological tests for non-A, non-B hepatitis. The Working Party agreed to recommend to the Medical Research Council that such a study should be undertaken. Can you assist us with why the department were keen that this study should be undertaken?
Well, as far as I can see, there must have been a suggestion that such a study should be undertaken. And we probably had a proposal, probably from Dr. Krask, but I can't tell from this paper as it's drafted here. But basically, really trying to elucidate what was going on with regard to these various concentrates. And this would have been, obviously the study is talking about patients undergoing elective treatment requiring concentrate. So the patients would have needed the concentrate, and those would be the patients who could be followed then because they were going to get concentrate, and they could be followed prospectively to see what the consequences were in terms of whether they got non-A, non-B. But this was definitely a study relating to patients who required concentrate for their treatment.
This working party is then disbanded in, I think, by March of 1982. So it only met on 2 occasions. Now the problem of non-A, non-B hepatitis and understanding it and the need to learn more obviously hadn't gone away. I think the minutes of another meeting which refer to it being disbanded just talk about not wanting too many or duplication of effort. Can you recall why this particular working party didn't proceed further?
No, because of course the MRC was entirely separate from the department. This was a decision taken by the systems board or whatever. The MRC had a reasonably complicated structure. It made the department look quite clear and easy, I think. But the systems board then had another group, as my recollection, and this working party responded to it. And as far as I have understood from reading the papers, the reason they disbanded it was that they thought that actually this was an area of study and potential research that was being handled by a number of other relevant bodies, and that they didn't seem to have a specific role. Because actually, essentially, what was being looked at here was, again, operational research. It wasn't really fundamental research. They were not looking at the virus particles and other, the sort of thing that the MRC got involved in. They were actually doing studies, epidemiological studies, and so on. And they, I believe, looking at the papers, didn't necessarily feel that they needed to be involved, given that they could see there were a number of other bodies that were actually doing that sort of work and potentially funding it too.
So that's the Working Party on Post-Transfusion Hepatitis. We've then got the Advisory Group on Testing for the Presence of Hepatitis B antigen and its antibodies. So something of a mouthful.
Yes.
Broadly speaking, would it be right to understand that the title of that advisory group indicates what its role and remit was?
Absolutely, completely.
If we go to CBLA 307195, please. The top of the page is not terribly clear, but it's a meeting of that particular advisory group. It's held on the 6th of March 1980, and we can see from the list of attendees that you were there, as was Dr. Sibelius. And Dr. Sibelius was in Med IMCD, was she not?
Yes.
Infectious communicable diseases was her area of speciality. I think you referred to this earlier, but it's right to understand, isn't it, that this particular advisory group had, as I think you said earlier, been around for a number of years.
Yes.
But it didn't meet on a regular basis. It met and produced from time to time and produced reports from time to time.
Yes, I don't know how regularly it may have met in order to prepare the reports, but from, again, reading the papers, I think I was attending in the sort of third tranche of meetings. There had been 2 previous reports from the earliest days. The first one, I think, when the Working Party was set up, when it was first discovered that there was a thing called the Dane particle, which was the virus of hepatitis B, and then the Australia antigen, the surface antigen. So there was, they met, they considered, they produced a report, and then there were obvious developments. I don't exactly know what the developments were. They met, they considered, and they produced another report. And then I came in on the considerations which led to the third report. That's my recollection.
And if we go to the second page, we can see it's quite faint, but paragraph 3, terms of reference of the advisory group. And we can see why it's meeting again. So it said that the advisory group's field of activity appeared to need some re-examination. And then if we go to the next paragraph, we can see that you and Dr. Sibelius are recorded as explaining that a new committee was being set up to deal with all aspects of communicable hepatitis. And it was the intention that this advisory group should become one of its subcommittees. Now, we'll look at the new committee in a few minutes. So that's the advisory group on hepatitis that was set up by the department. And the plan was that this hepatitis B advisory group would then become a subcommittee of the overarching advisory group. Right. And then if we just look further down the page, we've got the non-A, non-B hepatitis work of the MRC group. So that's the one we were just looking at. But I just want to look at the last paragraph on that page. We can see it records members being concerned about the incidence of non-A, non-B hepatitis, possibility that new viruses were perhaps being introduced through the use of commercial blood products, namely factor 8 and 9. Professor Zuckerman reported he knew of 2 haemophiliacs who'd suffered severe non-A, non-B hepatitis after receiving commercial concentrates. In both cases, the disease had a short incubation period. And then this, members agreed that the hazard from non-A, non-B hepatitis should now be recognised and brought to the attention of the appropriate departmental bodies responsible for the control of hepatitis. And then there's a record of the chair asking, saying he'd asked regional transfusion directors to provide Professor Zuckerman with sera for research. So who would have been the appropriate departmental bodies responsible for control of hepatitis to which the hazard of non-A, non-B hepatitis should be brought to their attention?
I would have said that the reason that the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Evans, proposed to the Chief Medical Officer that there should be a hepatitis advisory group, an overarching entity, was because there was a realisation that this was becoming an issue and that the department there shouldn't be a whole lot of disparate committees or groups looking at things in isolation, but that it should come under an overarching hepatitis advisory group. And that would have been the department's expert advisory group on hepatitis then, which they would have looked to provide ongoing advice on hepatitis.
And then if we go to page 4, please, Shomek, we can see bottom half of the page, again, there's a discussion on factor 8 and 9 associated transfusion hepatitis presented by Dr. Krask. If we go to the next page, it's the second paragraph from the top. Commercial concentrates have been available for use in the UK over the last, this is 5 years. Evidence suggested that there would be a continued association of cases of non-B hepatitis with their use in the future. Members were informed that this information was already available to the department in an annual report on the study, which was supported by a research grant. Dr. Krask intended to continue the study for several years, visiting centres which were associated with hepatologists to obtain more details which might isolate the etiological agents. Members agreed that the new hepatitis committee should be informed of Dr. Krask's study and should be notified of the concern and views of this group. Mm-hmm. So, two things, Dr. Walford. The first is, it would appear that the department was in receipt of annual reports directly from Dr. Krask, perhaps because it was funding his research. Is that right?
We did. We got them. We sometimes saw them, as I've explained before, when he was presenting to the UK HCDO, and then we would get the final report. Often he was presenting before he'd completely finalised his report, but then it would come to the department and undoubtedly would have gone to the new hepatitis advisory group.
And so the second issue to emerge from this paragraph is the new hepatitis committee is to be notified of the concerns and views of the group, and that's obviously on the topic of non-A, non-B hepatitis.
Yes.
And then if we go to CBLA 301167, this is another meeting. It's described as the 5th meeting of the reconvened advisory group on testing for the presence of hepatitis B surface antigen and its antibody. It's the hepatitis B advisory group for shorthand. Meeting 17th of September 1980. You and Dr. Sibelius and indeed others from the department are there. We could go to the bottom of the page 3, please. We can see reference under the heading, the Hepatitis Advisory Group, to Dr. Sibelius saying this. Dr. Sibelius informed members that as a result of numerous requests to the department for advice, and I think that might maybe the word on, something like that, diverse problems regarding viral hepatitis B, non-A, non-B being particularly problematic, and about questions relating to occupational hazards affecting staff and patients, it was decided that it was essential to set up an advisory group which would consider and advise on these matters. It's clear from this, taking what Dr. Sibelius is saying at face value, that the department was receiving numerous requests for advice, including in relation to non-A, non-B hepatitis. Are you able to assist us with what those requests might have been, or would that have gone to IMCD?
Yes, I mean, I'm just interested to see here. I don't recall reading this paper, but I've probably seen it. But I'm interested to see that it's Dr. Sibelius that is telling the committee, because basically it is possible that IMCD was receiving numerous requests for advice. I don't actually recall necessarily, but I can't be sure. But I don't particularly recall that, and it would actually, that advice would be more, or that request, or requests would more properly be sent to IMCD.
So you may not have been receiving those in SEB, but the department was clearly receiving them. But before we turn then to the new advisory group on hepatitis, just finishing off with the Hepatitis B advisory group. Can we go to PRSE 40862, please? So this is the third report of the advisory group on testing for the presence of hepatitis B surface antigen and its antibody. Unsurprisingly, much of the content of the report relates to hepatitis B, and I'm not proposing to ask you about that. But if we could go to, first of all, page 9, we can see that there is a short reference to non-A non-B hepatitis at the bottom of the page. So non-A non-B hepatitis viruses are a common cause of post-transfusion hepatitis in the US, are thought to have been responsible for cases in the UK. Hepatitis due to these viruses is common among haemophiliacs, follows the administration of imported and occasionally of British factor 8 and factor 9. There's evidence for the occurrence of sporadic cases of non-A non-B in the general adult population and in association with cryoprecipitate therapy in the UK. And then over the page, second paragraph, so the paragraph number 24, we recommend that research is undertaken in the UK to determine the extent and severity of post-transfusion hepatitis due to non-A non-B hepatitis viruses. And there's an explanation in the next sentence as to why. And then this, regional transfusion directors should encourage hospital haematologists to report all cases of post-transfusion jaundice, and where these could be due to non-A non-B hepatitis, the fact should be reported to the appropriate advisor in blood transfusion at the Department of Health and Social Security or Scottish Home and Health Department. So it appears to be a recommendation in the report for there to be a reporting system of post-transfusion non-A non-B hepatitis cases or possible cases to the department or to its Scottish equivalent. Can you assist us any more with what that reporting system comprised and who was the appropriate advisor?
It would have been Dr. Gunson, the consultant advisor. We were not ourselves as officials called advisors. So if they're saying the appropriate advisor, this will be the consultant advisor in blood transfusion. And this is coming from the regional transfusion directors to the consultant advisor in blood transfusion, and therefore into the department. But then I think it would have gone into Med IMCD after that.
But in any event, through whatever form, that information coming to Dr. Gunson should then have gone perhaps in his meetings with the CMO or through whatever route.
Yes.
It should have been passed on within the department.
Yes.
So that then leads us to the what was described as the new committee, the new group, the advisory group on hepatitis, which is the third committee on hepatitis I wanted to ask you about. If we go to DHSC 302195_062. Now, this is not a note that was copied to you at the time, but it is one which I know you've seen since. It's from T. Geffen, dated the 6th of November 1979, and it's addressed to Dr. Evans. And Dr. Evans was
the Deputy Chief Medical Officer with responsibility in relation to hepatitis, but also the other infectious disease.
And we can see if we look at the first paragraph, it refers to a decision in July, so that would have been July of 1979, because this minute is dated November 1979, to proceed with measures to obtain professional advice on the various problems of hepatitis. And then if we go to the third paragraph, it says this: we're of course faced with the need not to establish new advisory or other bodies without very good reason. And then there's a discussion about whether to attach it to the existing hepatitis B advisory group or whether it should be an advisory group in its own right. I don't want to get into the ins and outs of that, but were you aware that there was, as it were, a policy or a practice of not establishing new advisory or other bodies without very good reason?
Yes, I think it was the general thought that you thought very carefully before you established or asked to establish a new body. It has to be said that we needed to go to ministers to establish such a new body, so you thought very carefully for the rationale and what you would actually say could be done away with. I mean, essentially in terms of the use of staff within the DHSS who had to often service these meetings and so on. It made sense to be rational about the bodies and also to make sure that advice was coming to you. The most authoritative advice you could get was coming from a properly constituted body. So there was at the time, my recollection is that basically you thought hard and long before recommending yet another advisory group.
And as I think you alluded to a moment ago, it was something that required ministerial sign-off.
Yes.
And then if we just look at the last paragraph on this page, there's a discussion about an alternative option, about having an ad hoc group rather than a formal group. And then what's said about it is this: one disadvantage of this would be that we do really expect to need the advisory group, not only in the immediate future, but for some time ahead. And then there's reference to hepatitis B problems being with us for a long time. Now, would it be right to understand, whether from this or from your own knowledge more generally, that this was regarded as something which needed to be set up sooner rather than later, if I can put it that way?
I think from what I read now, though it wasn't the area in which I was directly involved with setting up of this this committee, but from what I read now, it was clearly felt by Dr. Evans, and Dr. Geffen was the head of MedIMCD before Dr. Field, must have felt this was really necessary and therefore advised the CMO that there should be such a committee. And I assume they will have done that because they will have known that this wasn't a problem that was going to go away.
Now, having seen the reference in here, there's an in-principle decision to do this in July of 1979. The group of which you were then part didn't meet until October 1980.
Really?
I just wanted to ask you a little about that. I'm not suggesting that was somehow your responsibility because you weren't involved in
No.
I think, in the formal decision-making processes. But you were covered into some of it, so I'm going to see if you can assist.
Yes.
If we look at DHSC 40857, we can see we're now February 1980. This is from Dr. Evans to Dr. Geffen, and it's apparent that it's been discussed with the CMO the previous week. So it seems to have taken a further period of time to get to CMO level, and the agreement that there's then reached, we can see recorded in the second sentence, it was agreed that the numerous problems arising in relation to hepatitis need to be brought together into one advisory group on hepatitis rather than be dealt with in a scattered fashion by various ad hoc groups. And then we can see from the second paragraph that there's then got to be a note for the CMO to essentially seek ministerial approval. Is that the right way of understanding the decision-making process?
Yes, it is. I suppose the question is, why did it take so long to get to that point? And the answer is, as you've rightly pointed out, I don't actually know. But clearly it did, and it was clear that the CMO was going to be involved in actually briefing ministers and getting their approval.
And then, there are aspects in which you were directly involved. I don't think we need to go to that, but I think you were asked to draw up terms of reference, for example, and did so. And I'm not suggesting that contributes to the delay. But if we go to just a memo from you and Dr. Sibelius, I think. No, it's a memo addressed to you and to Dr. Oliver. DHSC 40884. So it's from Phyllis Fernall in Med SM4. So that's Med SEB, isn't it? That's the same, your division.
Yes.
To you and to Dr. Oliver. It's dated the 27th of June 1980. And it's referring to what, essentially, I'm going to paraphrase for speed, what should now happen to the advisory group on the testing for hepatitis B antigen and its antibody. But if we look at the second paragraph, Dr. Sibelius has told me that ministers have agreed to the setting up of the hepatitis advisory group with the strict proviso that there should be no other committees concerned with hepatitis in operation, and this means that on no account should the meeting of the advisory group on hepatitis B be arranged. So it would appear that by the end of June 1980, there's now ministerial approval, but we're now nearly a year on from when the decision in principle has to recommend it's been made. Do you have any idea as to why it took almost a year to get to that stage?
No, I'm afraid I can't help on that. It's obviously a long time.
And then would it be right to understand what's said in paragraph 2? And I know it's Dr. Sibelius, not you, but this is essentially, is it a sort of case of too many cooks spoil the broth? We want there to be a single overarching group that looks at everything.
I understood from this exchange, looking at it now, that basically ministers were not keen on extra groups and essentially didn't want the advisory group on testing for hepatitis B to continue as a standalone committee. And the way we tackled that, if you like, because that was a very valuable committee. I mean, it was a part of the consideration that could well stand alone, the testing for hepatitis B and its antibody, a very technical discussion, was to make that committee a subcommittee of the main hepatitis advisory group. So it didn't then operate as a freestanding committee, it was a subcommittee reporting to the hepatitis advisory group.
And then just for the sake of completeness, if we go to DHSC 302201_011, sorry, Shamit. It sets out matters of background, which I'm not going to go to, but we can look at the bottom of the page at what the terms of reference are. If we pick it up just above the paragraph referring to terms of reference, we can see it says that at the request of the health departments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, the group advises all the departments in the United Kingdom, each of which have an officer present at meetings, and then the terms of reference to provide medical advice to the chief medical officers of the health departments of the UK on all aspects of communicable hepatitis. So it's finally been established. There's a list of members. There's a first meeting in October 1980. Now, you were present at, I think, the majority of the meetings between 1980 and 1983. I'm quite happy to take you to each of the sets of minutes if necessary. But I'll be doing so for the purpose of, as it were, perhaps demonstrating a negative. But I'm very happy to do so if it would assist you in answering what I'm going to ask you. My reading of the minutes, Dr. Walford, is that although we were told that non-A, non-B hepatitis was a pressing issue and the department was receiving numerous requests for advice, when one looks at each of the sets of minutes from 1983 to 1983, there's very little discussion about non-A, non-B hepatitis, and the focus, almost the entire focus, is hepatitis B. Now, I know you've had the opportunity to read the minutes. Are you able to comment on that without looking at them? Or able to assist us in understanding why there doesn't appear, in fact, to have been much of a discussion about non-A, non-B hepatitis?
Well, I can't really, absolutely accept that the three sets of minutes or whatever you described just don't seem to have much by way of non-A, non-B in it. I don't know why that was. I don't know. Of course, I was not responsible for setting the agenda. The agendas would have been down to the chair of the committee. I think Sir Robert Williams was the chair of this.
Let's just look at one
committee.
set of minutes just to see who was involved. So if we just look at the first meeting, DHSC 302199_066.
Yes, it was Sir Robert.
You're right. So Sir Robert Williams was chair, and who was he?
He was the former director of the Public Health Laboratory Service.
And then I think we can see certainly some names of regional transfusion directors there. Dr. Lane, of course. Dr. Sibelius is the medical secretary, and then there's a number of representatives from the Department of Health, including you, and including Dr. Harris as deputy CMO. And then we've got at that meeting a representative from Scotland and Northern Ireland. So the agenda would have been set, would it, by Sir Robert Williams?
Yes.
What was your role, and indeed the role of your DHSS colleagues on the committee or the group?
I mean, apart from being in attendance at the meetings, it was obviously a DHSS convened meeting, and therefore DHSS representatives were in attendance if they weren't being secretaries or having a membership of a particular committee. So I was clearly in attendance. Dr. Sibelius, as medical secretary, would be in the lead for any talk about the agenda with Sir Robert. And I don't think I had a very specific role. I can't remember, without looking, of course, again, without being shown, the extent to which I did or did not contribute to the discussion.
There was certainly no particular contribution from you that I wanted to draw to your attention or ask you about.
Okay.
So just so that others, in particular legal representatives, if they wish to, can look at the minutes. I'm not going, as I say, take Dr. Walford through them. She's read them. I've read them to show what's not there, but it means that anyone who wants to can have a look at the minutes themselves. So I'm just going to read out the URNs, if I may. DHSC 302199_066 is the minutes for this first meeting. The second meeting of the 5th of December is DHSC 302201_070. The third meeting is the 11th of May 1981, DHSC 40128. There's then a meeting in October 1981. This was not provided to Dr. Walford, but I will just give this to, again, for broader benefit. NHBT 5068_048. And then there's a meeting in October 1982, NHBT 5068_021B. And then there's a meeting in October 1983, BPLL 308168. So if anyone wants to look at those, they can. As I say, Dr. Walford's seen all of them, bar I think the 1981 meeting, which I'm not sure whether you were present, Dr. Walford. Can I then just ask you in general terms this? Do you think the department was slow to pick up on and respond to the significance of and the risks of non-A, non-B hepatitis?
Well, just listening to what you've got to say about it and listening to the length of time it took us to set up this particular meeting, I mean, it was not slow in terms of the generality of the way in which the department operated, because there are instances in the papers that you've given me where really and truly the pace was not what one desirably would want to see in terms of moving things along. The department was quite monolith. It was quite, there was an element of bureaucracy involved, so it didn't move with the speed of summer lightning, how shall I say. So this was probably not slower than other working parties or other working groups would work, but clearly with the benefit of hindsight and looking at the time it was taking, and of course as you've drawn out now, which may have been less apparent when one was up close, was that one of the issues that should have been of considerable concern, which was non-A, non-B, was not perhaps getting the attention that it should have got, at least not overtly as recorded in the minutes.
Thank you. Now I'm going to move now to a fresh topic, which is the question of self-sufficiency and the redevelopment of Bpl. And I've got a handful of general questions I'm going to ask you first of all, which I think we can probably fit in before the break, and then start looking at some of the detail with you after the break.
Yes.
When you took up your role in the Department of Health, and certainly in Med-SEB, what was your understanding of the department's or the government's policy on self-sufficiency?
I think it was always understood that that was the policy. I mean, basically, that was the policy. And that it had been the policy for a long time.
The inquiries heard evidence from Lord Owen and looked at some of what Lord Owen decided and stated in the period of time when he was Secretary of State for Health in the mid-1970s. I think that just before your time, in terms of your first position with the Medicines Division at the department, do you recall whether you were aware specifically of what Lord Owen had said or of those commitments, pledges, whatever one wants to call them, that had been made?
I don't think early on I was. It's very difficult now because I know what I know now. It's very difficult for me to be absolutely certain what I know. I don't think I was particularly aware of it when I joined Med-SEB, nor when I had been in Medicines Division, but joining at Med-SEB, I don't think I was particularly aware of it. I knew in broad terms that that was the aim, but not really the detail of Lord Owen now's involvement, nor the fact that I subsequently learned that money had been provided to go some way towards self-sufficiency. So, in general terms, it felt as if it was a policy that had been sort of ongoing for some time.
Would it be right to understand, again, please correct me if this is wrong, that when certainly by the time you've joined Med-SEB, was there any policy of achieving self-sufficiency in existence already at that time within a particular time frame? So had a date been fixed?
No.
And what was your understanding, maybe asking you the obvious, but what was your understanding of the reasons for the policy of working to achieve self-sufficiency?
Well, I think that the World Health Organization's avowed policy, which was what we were espousing at the time, was that it was wrong to deprive other countries of their human resource, if you will, the plasma from maybe developing countries, that essentially every country should rely on its own population to supply the amount of plasma that they needed to make whatever products they needed to make. That was, I think, the avowed reason for the World Health Organization. If it subsequently, or at the time, and I couldn't say, actually then involved the fact that some countries might have a higher incidence of an infectious organism in their plasma, that was, I got the impression, was sort of second order to it, to the fact that every country should provide its own plasma from its own donors and not seek to exploit, if you will, the human resource of people in underdeveloped countries.
So the safety issue, the risk issue, was as it were secondary. I don't mean in your mind. I mean your understanding of the reason for the policy.
I can't tell really how the two, because I wasn't around when the WHO pronounced, how the two things came together. But I think that what I've talked about was the fundamental reason, and I would have supposed that coupled with that maybe, but there must be documentation which will show that the risk of transmission of infectious diseases was obviously going to be greater if you move from one population with one incidence of a particular infection to another population's recipients who maybe that country had a lower incidence of a particular infection.
And I know My understanding is you wouldn't have been directly involved in personally briefing a new minister certainly about self-sufficiency.
No.
Would you have any knowledge or expectation of whether new ministers would be briefed on that? Would you have expected them to have been briefed that was the policy?
I would expect not necessarily new ministers in general, but actually whatever minister had the blood and blood products brief, because each minister had their own area, I would have expected, probably as a matter of general underlying principle, that they would have had a brief on that, yes.
And then just dealing with BPL, first of all, again, in quite general terms, BPL was, as your statement makes clear, a manufacturing facility wholly owned and funded by the department, by the time with which we're concerned, or you're concerned, and accountable to the Secretary of State.
Yes.
And then in your statement, you've given us an overview of the management and decision-making structure in relation to BPL. Could we put your statement back on screen? It's WITN 4461001. It's paragraph 15.4.
May I just check something for my own satisfaction? You've said that the BPL was wholly owned and funded by the department throughout the time that which you're aware. It had been the Lister Institute, had it not?
Yes.
Which was not a governmental organisation as such,
No.
though it supplied to the NHS. And that arrangement finished in 1978.
Yes.
My understanding was that after that, it had been jointly
Yes.
run by the department and
Yes.
by the region.
That's right.
And the region's funding was not centrally controlled.
No, but the funding for BPL all came from the Department of Health. The region did not fund BPL. It was a device to allow the employment of BPL staff and so on, because the North West Thames Regional Health Authority had employed many staff and had all sorts of departments, which the department itself didn't have. So it was necessary to have another entity, which turned out to be the North West Thames Regional Health Authority, because BPL was based in the North West Thames area, to, as it were, partner with the department. But the funding came exclusively from the department.
So it wasn't a case of the North West Thames Regional Health Authority spending any money or putting up any money.
No, on the contrary.
And it wasn't a question of, was it a question of cross-accounting? Do you know that detail?
I wouldn't know the detail.
That would be for the finance side, would it?
Be for finance.
And we can see the structure discussed. If we go to page 43, we can see bottom of the page, paragraph 15.4. Dr. Walford says it may be useful to summarise the decision-making structures at the time. And then if we go over the page, we can see, Dr. Walford, you described the central blood laboratories, and it's important to understand that because we see that phrase used in some of the documents, which comprise BPL, PFL in Oxford, and the blood group reference laboratory. And then until October 1978, they were managed for the department by the Lister Institute. Again, I don't think we need to trouble you with particular dates, but the department purchased the site,
Yes.
did it not, from the Lister
Yes.
Institute around that time.
Yes.
Is it right to understand, again, I'll pick this up later, I think, but there had been some form of joint arrangement between the Medical Research Council and the Lister, I think, earlier
Earlier.
and then by the mid-70s, it was the Lister on its own. And then, as you set out here, from October 1978, managed jointly by the department and North West Thames Regional Health Authority. And that was only ever intended to be temporary, wasn't
Yes.
it? And then there were two committees. I'm just going to identify them now because we're going to look at a number
Yes.
of their minutes. So there was the Joint Management Committee, chaired by the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, and then there was the Scientific and Technical Committee. And I think you are often in attendance at both
Yes.
those meetings. So again, we'll look at that. And then you explain how from December 1980 there was an additional committee, the Advisory Committee on the National Blood Transfusion Service, and then various ad hoc working parties, in particular in relation to the redevelopment and aspects of the redevelopment of Bpl. Again, we'll look at those to the extent necessary. And then over the page, those ad hoc working parties included, we see at Little Roman 3, a policy steering group for the redevelopment of Bpl. Again, we'll look at that. And then you explain in the next subparagraph that in December 1982, the JMC, so the Joint Management Decision-Making Structure, was replaced by the Central Blood Laboratories Authority, the CBLA, and that was a special health authority set up by the Secretary of State to manage Bpl.
Yes.
So that overview brings me perfectly to 3:15, obviously as planned for the break, and then we'll pick up on some of the detail after the break.
Yes, well, we'll so we come back at 20 to 4. So 15:40, 20 to 4.
Thank you.